Good morning, Monday. It's Monday. We're doing a very special episode of the Next Project Conversations. We usually get together on Wednesdays and Thursdays, but I felt it was so important to have this gentleman on our show. The Reverend Ben McBride is one of the great social justice minds of our generation. I was reading a quote the other day that said we need to find new people to quote beside Dr. King, and I believe if you're looking for one of them, Reverend McBride is that. So I want to bring him on. I want to have him tell you a little bit about his history, to give some perspective, talk about how he's seen social justice in American context evolve since Ferguson. So right now we have my good friend, Reverend Ben McBride. How are you doing, sir?
Hey man, I'm alive and I'm glad to be in the land of the living. As you know, the saints used to say, it's good to be on this side of yonder. So I'm grateful and thankful to continue to be pushing.
So I got a couple of, well, can you give some of the people a little bit of background? Can you talk about like your initial like experiences in Ferguson and what you see and happen in the social justice space over the past year?
Sure. I mean, I think a little bit over a decade ago, I was pastored inside, the four walls, and really got the sense that, what was happening, particularly, with a lot of our communities around communal violence and neighbor to neighbor violence, was really becoming a challenge. And I wanted to figure out how to move myself in closer proximity to that, kind of coming out of that story and having the opportunity to work with other faith leaders and city officials and law enforcement alike. We were able to reduce homicides in the city of Oakland, where I moved to significantly, and we were feeling really good about that. It was in the middle of that dynamic in 2014 that Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson. To that point, I had not been incredibly engaged in the movement around police brutality and police violence. And yet I came to Ferguson, Missouri, particularly because of my orientation as it related to doing work around community violence and neighbor to
Mm-hmm.
neighbor violence. And when I got to Ferguson, that transformed me. I got baptized, I would like to say, into a different kind of anointing, particularly when one of the young men told me in Ferguson, I appreciate you all are here to contend for our lives in relationship to this racist police system. But my question is, what are you doing where you live? What are you doing as it relates to your local police department? Because as much as you have eyes to see me here in Ferguson, do you have eyes to see the version of me in Oakland? And what I began to realize was that even though I was working around communal gun violence, I had to get a wider analysis and a wider circle of human concern to address the issue. And since the Ferguson uprising, it really, for me, has been kind of capturing what I believe is the spirit in the movement of that uprising, has continued to teach me and bring me along the journey to try to figure out how we can really create a world, a country, a society where we can all belong, a society that really looks more like the kingdom or kingdom of God coming than it does the imperial systems that we read about.
So here goes a question for you. Um, you and I had the opportunity. You brought Tara Thompson, one of the leaders in the Ferguson uprising, and she said something so profound in our meeting. She said, the church left when it was dark.
Yeah.
They were there in the daytime, but they left when it was dark. And she's a young organizer, you know, prototypical of what we see. Do you think, with every pastor marching every day, every week now, do you think we're in danger of engendering that feeling in our current generation of organizers?
Yeah, man, I just forgot about that until you raised that. I remember when Tara Thompson from Hands Up United came out. We were
Mm-hmm.
part of that group with the faith leaders. I mean, I still think there is a critique that is out there, and I think an opportunity for us to learn. Right, what she was pointing out to in Ferguson was that the faith leaders and preachers and people of good faith were always willing. Well, not always, but at times would be willing to come outside during the day to do their marches, right? To do their solidarity actions, to try to figure out how to participate in a way that felt comfortable for them. But it was in the evenings when the state would come out and begin to gas the young people and fire military level projectiles against the young people and elderly people. When they would come out and beat people with their batons and point their weapons at people, and it was in those moments that the clergy and people of good faith and goodwill and believers would be absent. And a part of her call was, what would it look like for us to not just come outside when it's convenient, but what does it look like for us to actually come outside when it's inconvenient? And one of the things that I'm most concerned about right now in this moment is our young people are leading a movement of literally around the world. No organizing movements created this. This is a move of the spirit. I mean, to just think about 400 years after Black people being enslaved in this country, and now across the world, there is a prophetic call that Black Lives Matter, and people saying we don't want to live in an anti-Black racist world anymore, and we want change. There's a huge things happening, and yet I'm concerned about watching pastors and faith leaders seek to want to establish marches and protests, well, not protests, but marches with the police. And I think I want us to think about it. It would be as if God sends Moses back to Egypt to tell Pharaoh to let my people go, and Moses decides to go back and organize a peace march with Pharaoh.
Mm.
That's not what God said to Moses at the burning bush.
No, he
He
did
told
not.
God to go tell Pharaoh, stop killing, oppressing my people because I've heard their cry. And so I really am curious around our faith leaders in this moment who want to go march with the police. It would be as if Moses marched with Pharaoh or as if Jesus marched with Pilate. I think there's a different opportunity if we'll turn our ear to the Spirit.
I gotta. I'm gonna get to the young people part, but I want to ask you to engage in this question. You know, one of the things that God's been revealing to me is we've been using the wrong language.
Mm.
Every time a young black man gets shot in America, we want to talk about reconciliation. We want to talk about lament. We want to talk about how do we become heal the land when the land's not sick, it's the people in the land that are sick.
Mm.
Can you give me your perspective on the church's ability to sort of paint over tragedy with vigils and marches?
Yeah, I mean, I think these moments kind of reveal sometimes the need for a evolution of our theology, right?
Mm,
Like our theological orientation needs to be thick enough to actually hold up the gravity of the moments that we're in. I think it's important in me myself. I have been shaped. I grew up being shaped by a much more white evangelical Christian orientation through the Christian school that I went through, and that mixed and intersected with the Black Pentecostal, theology in the evening, but was still very fundamentalist in nature. That gave me, and I would argue sometimes gives us, an analysis that doesn't really give us and provide for us the floor by which for us to understand God's call for justice and fairness and what the kingdom or kingdom was really about, right? That Jesus was not preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. Jesus was preaching the gospel of the kingdom. High places come low, crooked places becoming straight. Those who have will come down, and the poor who have been oppressed will be lifted up. Jesus was talking about a world shifting, things turning upside down for the purposes of living out Isaiah 61, which he quoted in Luke 4. And so I think we've got to have a theology around that and be careful of the way in which the theology of the powerful causes us to try to think about what does it mean to make those who are in power more comfortable rather than trying to think about what does it mean to make those who are more oppressed more safe. And I think the Proverbs 31 verses 8 through 9 says, "Speak up for those who cannot speak up for themselves, defend the rights of the poor and needy." We know that everybody has the right to speak up for themselves, but in our current system, everyone does not have the proximity to be heard. And so I think what's important for us as faith leaders is to think about if we have proximity to being heard, how are we not carrying the message of empire or carrying the message of imperial theology that somehow just says, let's all get together? Yes, we can get together when we have undone the systems of oppression and racism and violence. Let's undo those things. Let's make that actually the cost of building the table for us to sit down together, as Dr. King said, the table of brotherhood. The pieces of wood necessary to build the table should no longer be the bones and the blood of our relatives, but the table that builds that table of brotherhood should be the deconstruction of racist and oppressive systems.
talk
Let's
that.
use that as hardware and no longer our sisters and brothers.
Mm. What is the greatest critique you have of the evangelical church at this moment? Let me use better language. What is the critique that you have of the majority white churches in our country, both progressive and evangelical? Because I'm starting to they they present different, but the effect's the same.
Well, I think the evangelical church is in a real identity crisis and has been so for the last 4 years, particularly because 89% of the evangelical church voted for a what I would call a neo-fascist white supremacist who's now in the White House. And so that creates a deep sense of soul searching. Our dear brother, Dr. Cornel West, said that white evangelicals have stood at the foot of Jesus' cross, caught his blood in a cup, turned it into Kool Aid, and served it up for mass consumption. I think there is a real critique around what has happened in the evangelical church that actually confuses American patriotism and imperialism with the message of a Palestinian Jew who lived on the underside of the Roman Empire, who was killed by the police of his day. And if Jesus, the Lord, your Lord and Savior, was killed by the police, why is it that you find yourselves theologically defending the actual system who killed your Lord and Savior? Just because God raised him from the dead doesn't mean that you should be complicit with the very system that killed him in the first place. So I think there's a deep identity crisis that evangelicals have to go on. And I would argue, very much like the Republican Party, they're in a moment right now where they're going to have to make some decisions around whether their system and whether their ideology will even be relevant over the next 20 to 30 years. And so I think but there are many leaders in the evangelical church right now who are waking up and have been waking up over the last several years, just as some of us have. I think there's an opportunity, particularly for white relatives and white evangelicals, to abandon whiteness. This doesn't mean that you abandon your Eurocentric uh, 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 um, sense of legacy and where you come from, but it means that you abandon the orientation of whiteness, the power structure, and you begin to follow Black people and people of color and indigenous folks, recognizing that the faith that was birthed in the Black church is actually the delivering power of Jesus rather than that American white imperialistic Christianity, which was actually used as a construct to oppress, rape, pillage, and destroy Black people. And so I think very much so, like the story in the scriptures has Joseph and his people coming into the house of Egypt for 400 years in the house of empire, because actually in the Jewish scriptures, it's not actually the word Egypt. The word actually is much more empire, coming into that place of empire for 400 years. And yet they are the ones who have the faith that can lead people to the promised land. I think white evangelicals and white progressive Christians have an opportunity to abandon whiteness and follow the leadership of Black folks, indigenous folks, and people of color in this moment and help save your soul.
Wow. Wow. One of the things I've always been impressed is that you are able to bridge theology to action. There's some people that are great in the academy, and then there's some people that are great in the street, but they never meet in the middle. So, can you give us a little bit about what I know you're doing two current projects, Bring the Heat and the Bend the Arc one. So, can you tell us about both those projects and how that people can get engaged in those and what they are?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, my word that I heard my brother Mike, who's much more the better theologian than I feel like I'm like the hood theologian, right? But
Oh
but
no.
the word that I love that he introduced me 2 years ago, theopraxis, right? And that's kind of where I try to live my life, right? Is in the middle of the intersection of that. I think right now that we have an opportunity as people of faith to live into the tradition of the stories that we've read, right? That the stories that we've read have always been about Exodus, empire, and exile. And I think we're in a moment right now where we can be a part of an exodus of Black people coming out of a system of empire. Now, we must be careful as we come out of and come through our exodus that we don't try to build up an empire, because when we build up an empire, this is some of Tom Holland's theology, the Scottish theologian, when we build up that empire, then God's gonna have to let us go into exile. And so I think we're in an Exodus moment right now. And a part of that Exodus moment, I really believe, is some of the work that we're doing around dismantling the police state in our country. Now, let me say just a quick moment around what dismantling the police state means. Let me first tell you what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that what I'm advocating and others are advocating is that we have no public safety system at all. That's not what we're saying. When you see defund the police, we are not saying that we should have no public safety system at all. Even when you hear people say abolish the police, they're not arguing for no safety system at all. What we are saying is that the current system we have was rooted in a history of slave patrols that did three major things: chase down runaway slaves, organized terrorists who enslaved Africans would run away, and use excessive force to gain compliance. Three descriptions that we can still see present in our current policing system. And so our move is to do something which we call bring the heat. And bring the heat means that we want to do a few things. One, we want to defund police departments. What does that mean? That means that we're going to stop resourcing police departments to do things that they should not be doing, like being in our schools, like responding to mental health situations, like being involved in domestic situations or community violence situations when young people are beefing with each other, when we have discovered that there are more strategies that actually have a higher success rate to be involved in that than police. The second thing we want to do as a part of our heat work is we want to fire all racist cops. We want to get police chiefs and police unions and mayors to come out and make a commitment that if you are a racist, you cannot be a cop. You cannot be a police officer. And then the third thing we want to do in bringing the heat is we want to get rid of this existing policing system we have while scaling up a new public safety system that is worthy of community trust. And HEAT is an acronym: hiring, equipment, accountability, and training. What we want to do is we want to scale up a new system that actually ensures that we are having people in our communities that should be there, that they're using the kinds of tactics and equipment that make us feel safe, that they have oversight from the civilian community, and they receive the kind of training that can provide safety and security instead of occupation and an over militarized experience. And so we're wanting to encourage people to go to bringtheheat.info, which is a way that you can get plugged in. You can join the campaign. It is an inter-organizational, inter-network movement. So you can join in with your congregation, you can join in with your organization. And then the second body of work that we're doing is called the Belong work. And this work is really about where I see our heat work as living in it. We want to figure out how do we do both cultural and structural belonging. And so one of the things that we're looking to do for people who might just be waking up to this conversation, we've got resources to figure out how do we help you get in deeper relationship with people across difference. Maybe you're a white person or you're a non-black person of color who in this moment is beginning to wake up to the deep pain that is happening to your black siblings and relatives. But you don't know what it means to actually be in relationship with black people and indigenous people right now. We want to figure out how to help you get into those kinds of relationships so that you can be the right kind of sibling and relative and ally that can really help make a world for all of us to inhabit, not just the most powerful.
Um, can you talk a little bit more about the racist cop piece on
Yeah.
what you're asking mayors and cities to do? Because I believe this is a piece that pastors and faith leaders and lay people and everybody can take to their police department right now and get something done.
Absolutely. If you go to bringtheheat.info, and you'll see up on the site in the top right corner of the web page is a button that says take the pledge, and you'll see information there. This might sound kind of silly, but it's a real thing. Never in the history of this republic has it actually been legislated that you cannot be a racist and be a cop. I just want us to sit with that. It has never been legislated in policies that if you are a racist, you cannot be a cop, right? And so, one of the things that we want to say to folks as you invite your mayors, your police chiefs, the heads of your police union, your sheriff, your city council, tell them what we are asking you to do is to make the public pledge and you will fire all racist cops and have a zero tolerance policy. So what does that mean? Somebody would say, well, how would you know whether people are racist? We are asking them, not only do we want you to continue to evaluate them in the hiring process, but even after they're on, you should be looking and monitoring for connections they have to the alt-right, connections they have to the Proud Boys, connections they have to other neo-Nazi white supremacist groups. You should be checking their phones, their government-issued phones, monitoring their text messages, monitoring their social media accounts. monitoring a lot of the police officer association Facebook groups that have constantly been revealed as places where all of this racist conversation is happening, and have a zero tolerance policy. If you find a cop making a racist statement, they are fired. Indefinitely, they are terminated. This is what we can begin to ask our cities to do. And then we ask them within 5 days to draft a policy, a city ordinance around how they can implement it. We did it in the city of Oakland. Our mayor took the pledge and they had a policy within 48 hours that was voted in by the city council. In the city of Stockton, California, the police chief, Eric Jones, made the public pledge to fire all racist cops and have a zero tolerance policy. They just passed it in New Jersey and are going to be moving to cement it this week. This is picking up across the country, and these are something that we can do right now.
We're having the chief in Palo Alto look at their hiring policy based around what you said. So hopefully we'll be able to move in that direction this year.
Yeah,
Question
yeah,
for you.
and just one thing I would say, certainly it's a part of the hiring process, but we need to ask them for new systems and policies in place to review the existing officers that they
Wow.
have.
Thank
So
you,
that
sir.
if someone has been radicalized over the last 2 to 3 years, what is your policies in place to discover that?
I've been receiving, there's a lot of academics in my area, and we've been discussing this. And one of the highlight points to the lack of police change has been the police unions. I want to hear your thoughts on police unions. I want to hear and how they have become more and more of a stumbling block for us moving real police reform forward.
Yeah, so the data is actually showing. I've been seeing a couple surveys over the last few days that wherever you have had stronger police unions formed, the level of violence and complaints has gone up. What is begin to paint the picture is that the more police officers feel that they have qualified immunity with no
Mm.
accountability, the higher expressions of violence and brutality end up happening to the people. Now, I think it has to be said that the gains that have happened over the last 100 years around organized labor are not gains that we can stand to lose. The 40-hour work week that we have, having 2 days off, all of these gains were gains that came out of, the early 1900s when many of our, ancestors and great grandparents were being forced into 6, 7 day weeks. We had children that were, in sweatshops and a whole other condition. But I do think we're going to have to start having some mature conversations inside our justice movements with our labor partners, because there has to be a way to protect organized labor without organized labor feeling like the only way to protect themselves is to protect an obvious white supremacist oriented police union structure that has a tendency to defend the officer regardless of the situation. We cannot have people in our communities who have the power to take away our life and freedom under the law able to do so with impunity. If a airline pilot had a history of crashing planes, and that pilot was able to continue to fly just because he found ways to get out of the plane before the plane crashed, we would deem him or her totally uh, 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 not able to participate with being a pilot. The notion that police get to shoot and kill people, the brother who killed George Floyd, who lynched our dear brother on the street, had already had multiple complaints in, had shot and killed other people in times past, and been protected by his police union. So we have to have conversations with our labor community. And what I would say to our professional community, we need you. I just got off some meetings early this morning. We need help beginning to do the research. We need help beginning to understand the data and figuring out how can we, you know, get the kind of data that's necessary that helps us figure out what kinds of solutions make sense, that are actually rooted not just in anecdotal experiences, but actually in hard data and science. And so I just want to put that plug to those in the professional community. This is a moment right now where actually the lowest way you could participate with us would be walking in the protest. Come show up in the protest. I'm thankful that you've got feet, and you can walk with us. But you also have got a brain, and many of you all have been trained with a special set of skills that can really help us begin to think our way into the future.
Well, you lead me into another thing. One of the things that I've learned from you for a relationship over the last 5 years, when you started training clergy, one of the things you started talking about where there were protesters, there were witnesses, there were organizers. You really dissected the movement for us, and what I've realized is that an army that moves things, only a small percentage are actually frontline fighters. It takes three people to get one fighter to the front line.
That's
Can
right.
you help our people that are watching this understand some of the other things? Because if they're seniors and they're not in their home, or they're professionals and they're not going to march, what help them understand how they can be part of this movement?
Yeah, yeah. So, I believe that the movement, very much so like the human body, is both physical, it is emotional, and it is mental. There's three aspects that make up the ability for us as human beings to function, and I think the same applies to movements. Certainly, there is a physical expression of the movement work that we need to do. People on the ground, marching, protesting, or organizing in physical ways, where they're showing up in space to have conversations with elected officials and people who hold power. That's a very important expression. We just heard this morning, it came out yesterday, but it's now, being verified this morning, that Minneapolis is disbanding its police department with a veto-proof city council, right? That is the nature of some of the powerful physical organizing work that's happening. But we also need the emotional side of it. Those who can be engaged in our spiritual work of praying for the people who are out, physically doing the work, praying for the hearts to change of the people who are in power, helping to do the kind of spiritual care and support for people who are engaging in the kinds of work. Just in Oakland, where I live, over the weekend, So Oakland put on a powerful healing space for several hours so that people could just come to the park and receive prayer. People who are feeling stressed out and overwhelmed and traumatized. So there is the work that happens around the emotional, the spiritual side of our work, which is as important as the physical work. And then there's the mental work. There's people who can bring the thinking and the scientific leadership and direction that can help us build systems to understand the challenge that we're facing, to help us make an analysis around what strategies will work and what strategies will be more difficult to work, to help do the research around what things have been tried already, so that we're not trying to reproduce some of the same things that have happened before, but we can actually build case studies and learn from what has happened to the past. We can crush data. So the movement exists in a variety of different ways. Oftentimes, you've heard me, bro, say everybody doesn't have to do the same thing, but everybody has to do something. And so, whether
Exactly.
that is a physical, an emotional, spiritual, or whether it is a mental orientation towards the movement, I think it's important for us to all be responsive to our vocation. The other thing I would say is for us to also ensure that we are not um, um, downing or depreciating other expressions of the movement that are not our own. So if I'm in the physical movement, I don't need to look down at those who are doing the mental work as if somehow my expression is better than their expression. We needed all of it. We have always needed all of it. Dr. King, when he was doing work in the streets, had Bayard Rustin, who was doing a lot of the thinking and the planning around that work. Then there were a lot of the women who were actually holding up the spirit and the soul of the work, and doing a lot of the movement work on the ground as well as the thinking. People were moved all around in these different roles, and many of us might move between some of those different roles. But let's have a shared appreciation for all of us being on the bus, regardless of the seat.
So, early in the conversation, you talked about the young people leading. It's blessed me. One of the things, I'm in my mid 40s now, and I feel like My job is not to lead these young people. My job is to just hold them up and be behind them, because they're the ones with the networks at the colleges and the high schools and social media that are getting thousands of people. These aren't being organized by churches.
That's right.
These are So I think it's important for us to get behind them and push them. Can you tell me some of the examples of young leaders you're seeing and what your thoughts are on them, where you see them going?
The young leaders that are popping up now are simply amazing me. Last Sunday, not just yesterday, but the Sunday before, I participated with a protest, a march that was led by some young black women who were in their early 20s who had never led a protest before, and they had at least 3,000 people in the streets.
Wow.
The next day, I showed up at a protest being led by a 19-year-old who came back to his high school and had 15,000 people in the street. His first ever protest. Let me tell you, at the first protest I led, there was not 8,000 or 15,000 people in the streets. It probably would have
No, they weren't.
scared me and made me go home. What it's showing me is that these young people have a spirit inside them that is
Mm.
saying that they want to create a very different world. And the beautiful thing to me is that it's not just young black children, but it's young brown children, it's young immigrant children, it's young white children who are coming out saying we want to live in a different world. And it's inspiring to us. Now, you know, the scriptures teach us that there's places for all of us across generation, right? That God calls the old because they're wise and the young because they're strong, right? And so I think there is an ability for us to think about how do we help our young people, support them with things we may have learned. Support doesn't mean control. Support means, hey, I can offer you some thinking or some thoughts that I have. I can be open to your ability to reject them. I can come alongside you at your march. I can ask you it is that I can do to help. For example, one of the marches I was at, I came, I told them I don't need to speak. I'm just here to support you all. Finally, they said, hey, we want you to speak. I said a few words. We got towards the end of the march, and I said, how are you guys going to get everybody back to the original marching location? They hadn't really thought of all of that yet. And I said, how can I help? They didn't really know how to help. I said, you want us to help march people back to the original location? They said that would be helpful. So we did that. And so there became an opportunity to help provide leadership, but it was at the request of the young
Mm.
people. And so I think if we show up, I've had this line for some time. We should always show up as learners and wait for an invitation to lead if such an invitation ever comes. So I say to pastors and preachers all the time, people say, well, nobody's calling me to come out and speak at the move in the protest or speak at the march. Nobody calls me either. Just show up. Just show up because you love the young people. Show up because you love the people. Put your collar on so that they know there's a faith leader out there who cares about them and be a part of their movement and be there to love on folks. I think that's one of the best ways that we can live out what I understand is the gospel of Jesus.
You know, Otis Moss III put out a great piece the other day talking about some of the limitations of the black church, being smaller churches, pastors, and the pressures and why there's challenges with them engaging with the movement. I know there are a lot of pastors that this is their first time trying to engage in social justice. Can you give them two or three tips as far as how to go to protests, what to do, how to be? You started this in Ferguson, so you've honed this over the years. So I think a lot of pastors could use your knowledge to figure out how to fit into this greater movement.
Yeah, absolutely. A few practical steps. First one, just show up to bear witness. Don't show up to talk. Don't show up with expectations to be recognized um, or even to be respected. Show
Mm.
up to bear witness, right? When we first got to Ferguson, many times our presence was questioned by the young people. When I first started showing up in the streets in Oakland in protest, I had a young black brother that told me, he was like, what you out here for? I said, man, I'm out here for the same reason you out here. He said, no, you're not. No, no, you're not. He was like, because you wearing that white man collar. I said, oh no, brother,
Mm.
that's not, that's not what I bring towards it. He's like, oh, you just don't know what's up. I said, no, I'm out here with you. He said, no, you're not. Personally, my feelings got hurt in that moment. But what I had to realize was that the young brother's analysis is informed by a certain understanding. And so I have the opportunity to either get offended or I have the opportunity to lean in and to continue to listen and to learn and recognize that I'm there to love. So I encourage people, show up to bear witness. Number two, I encourage people, pastors, if you're looking for a role, one of the roles you can always do is to put your bodies in between the police and the people. Show our young people that you care about them by being willing to position your physical body in between violence and them. Our scriptures teach us, Jesus says, no greater love does anyone have than they're willing to lay down their lives for our friends. Jesus said, if you love me, obey my commandments. Do what it is that I say. So Jesus said, if you're going to follow me now, you got to follow me. You got to follow what I do. So I encourage pastors, and you'd be surprised that when faith leaders get in between the young people or people in the community and the police, it creates a conundrum for the cops because we marry them, we bury their relatives, we counsel them. So when you stand there with your collar, you begin to force them to make a decision whether they're going to be a violent, uh, 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 expression of the state, or whether they're going to take an opportunity to be a conscientious objector. And so I would say get in between the police and the community if you're at protests. And then I would say towards the end of any protest, identify who the leaders are, if you can, and if there seems to be some kind of centralized leader, just go up and introduce yourself to them, thank them for providing leadership, give them your contact information, and say, I want to be a support to you if I can. Feel free to text me if there's a way that I can support, if there's ways that I can come to a meeting, if there's ways that I could maybe get some people from my congregation to bring water for y'all next time, or just to be a resource. But here's my number. You call me if you have a need, and I'll do my best to try to help. I think those are three concrete ways that people can begin to participate in the protest.
Wow, that's such there's such wisdom in what you just said. You've been doing this a long time, my friend, and it's been you've inspired me, and it's been just an honor to watch you work over the last 5 years because it's been consistent and it's been ethical and it's been the same, which is unusual to say in this space. I want you to tell me, where do you see us going? I know a lot of people are engaged this week, but we've got November coming up. We still have COVID in the air. So there's health disparities that we aren't even talking about and policing disparities. And there's so much in the air right now. Where do you see us going?
I think we're in a generational moment, um, and I don't see this energy just disappearing. Unfortunately, the president is going to be doing things over the next several months that is going to continue to create psychic injury for Black people and Indigenous people and people of color. He has 4 or 5 years now, at least in the public venue, of demonstrating that. I think what is super important for us is for us to be disciplined. And what you noted, and hopefully what I've tried to live into is to be consistent. So I think what we need to recognize is that there's the macro work and then there's the micro work, right? The micro work is all of us need to not just be engaged in um, protesting, but we need to do the work in our local cities to transform the public safety system and dismantle the police state so that we can erect a real system that creates safety and security for all of God's children. We need to be doing that work. And then in the macro work, we need to be getting all of our people that we know registered to vote. We need to go to the ballot box, and we need to ensure that we are voting the interests of the marginalized. I want to say this because I say that on purpose. I actually think that people who follow Jesus and are trying to bring in the kingdom of God that Jesus talked about should not vote their own self interest in a democracy. I actually think that the scriptures call us to vote the interests of the most marginalized.
Wow.
We see that showing up in the book of Acts, chapter 2, where it says that they discovered, who had extra resources and they distributed to them as they had need. They saw their civic role as being in service to their theological responsibilities to take care of those most marginalized. And so I would be encouraging all of us. Voting this November might mean not just at the federal level, but as you look at state policies, as you look at tax policies and initiatives that are on the ballot, vote the interests of those most marginalized around you so that we can ensure that all of our sisters and brothers are being lifted. But it's going to take discipline, discipline, discipline. And I would encourage us in moments where you feel like you're hearing what feels like an extreme left or an extreme radical position about whether it's the conversation of policing or something else that's happening in the country. And maybe some of us that might be a little bit more moderate might feel uncomfortable in that. Instead of shutting down and defaulting to an imperial posture, make a disciplined, concerted effort to get in conversation with someone and learn more about that position. We don't need us, because of fear and anxiety, to run away from the need to move this country forward. If we can be in conversation with each other, I think it will help more of us begin to transform this country so that it can really finally, for the first time, live into its notion of being a place that really can give and promise everyone life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Quick question, and it just came to me as we were speaking. One of the patterns I've seen since I've been in California is dealing with allies and then dealing with those that will come to a Black Lives Matters event, march, protest, and want to talk about ecology or the Israeli Palestine conflict or whatever it is. Not that they're unimportant issues, but they're not the issue we're there for. Can you give us some advice dealing with allies and then dealing with those that would hang on or try to change the subject of an event position?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, so here's one of the first rules I try to operate from when being at the protest. Try not to police the protest, because policing people's speech and tone policing can create different kinds of environment, particularly if you don't have relationship with those folks. Like oftentimes people have said to me before, we'll be at a protest and somebody's spouting off, and it's not a protest that I'm leading or helping to organize. And they'll say, man, we need to go stop that person. I'm like, well, let's allow the people who put the action together to facilitate that. And then if we want to have feedback, let's get in a relationship with people so that we have the relationships to have that feedback. But where we do have relationships and where we are involved, I've been very direct with people to say that this is a conversation about ending anti-black racism in America, particularly through the systems of policing and the many other systems that have caused black people to find themselves at a high risk to die at the end of the COVID virus and a variety of other different situations. And I call on people and I challenge them to keep the main thing the main thing. I was in a conversation with a relative who righteously, wanted to have a conversation about, well, how can we have the conversation of abolishing the police and abolishing ICE? I said, I don't believe that it is right for us to try to have both of those conversations, because 2 years ago, when you wanted to have a conversation about abolishing ICE because of what was happening, particularly to our brown skinned southern border relatives, we were all in with you with a focus on ensuring that we protected the lives of our brown skinned southern border immigrants. Now we are having a conversation about Black lives. And there's a tendency in American culture that when you start talking about Black lives, everybody wants to talk about everything else. So I want to encourage people where we have relationships to ask people, I hear what you're saying, sister or brother. Right now, the conversation is about Black lives. Will you join me in having that conversation about Black lives? Will you recognize that you disappearing the conversation about Black lives is another act of violence? I am asking you, after 400 years, to focus on the story of Black lives. And as we continue to have that conversation, we'll have other conversations in their appropriate settings. But let's keep the conversation about Black lives, because that is one of the ways that we show that Black lives matter, is our ability to stay disciplined in contending for Black lives.
Is there anything else you want to let the people know? I know we ran a little longer than we expected, but
No, it's all good. I appreciate you, everybody that's out there. Listen, if you are waking up for the first time in this moment, and maybe the knee on George Floyd's neck and that brother being lynched is what broke your heart and really is providing invitation for you to do something. I want to say welcome. You're not too late. You right on time. I want to say that I was somebody who lived in Oakland, and yet when our dear brother Oscar Grant was killed by those police, literally 5 to 7 minutes from my house, it did not shake me into action the way that it should have. It took Michael Brown all the way in Ferguson, Missouri, to shake me into action. So don't guilt yourself about being too late. Today is the moment for you to continue on the journey that you're on for us to deconstruct the police state. I want to invite you, go to bringtheheat.info, bringtheheat.info, and go ahead and sign up, get involved for the work that we're doing. There's going to be ways that you can plug in. You don't have to try to go through an organization, although there will be organizations that will start providing partners that you can partner with. But if you want to engage with your church, with your congregation, with your school group, with a group that's through your employer, try to find ways to engage. We're going to provide tools and resources. We need all of you. I'm grateful, that you're turning your ear this way. The only way we get through this is certainly with God, but it's also with each other. Let's make sure that we stay with each other.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. Hold on one second. People, I want to thank you so much for all that you have. I want to thank you for watching this show. I want to thank Reverend Ben McBride for speaking so powerfully today. This is a time for all of us to get active. We'll see you at a regular time on Wednesday at 12 p.m. And we will have somebody I consider one of the great black poets of our nation, Dr. Joshua Bennett from Dartmouth. He is an amazing young man, and he has been writing on the pain of black people. So from this black poet perspective, I want him to start speaking to what he's seeing and how he's interpreting the pain of the black voice in our current situation. Thank you so much. Bye.